The world is much larger now. It has been increased from 2000 by 2000 pixels to 3000 by 3000. So that's actually an increase of over 100%. That more than doubles the size of the world because 2000 by 2000 is 4 million and 3000 by 3000 is 9 million. So we've more than doubled the square pixels that we can walk around in. And it actually feels quite liberating because now there's twice as many places to walk around in and explore, more cubes to peek around. And naturally, as the world is over twice as large now, I also added more cubes and more mannequins. So whereas before there were only 5 cubes that would randomly get rendered, now there are actually 10. So if you can see the mouse here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and there's a 10th one back there. And there's also twice as many mannequins. So before there were 10 mannequins and now there are 20. I'm not going to go through and count them, but you can just visually see there's quite a lot of mannequins now. And eventually those will be human-controlled players so that we can all navigate this world in a multiplayer environment. So that pretty much sums up the front end of the update. It's actually quite liberating, as I said earlier. It's fun to walk around this. And all of the previous updates are still intact. So there's still obstacle detection. You cannot go through cubes. There's still these world boundaries. You can't walk off of the world even though it's much larger. I guess you can walk behind this cube, so that's a small bug that has to be fixed, but that should be pretty easy. But you cannot walk through the cube. So if I try to walk into this cube here, even though it's in a new part of the world, I cannot walk through it. So this update actually involved all 3 languages, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So I'll now go into the code changes, the updates to the code that made this world even larger. By the way, in the comments, feel free to let me know what you think about this update. Please leave all sorts of positive feedback, but also leave any sort of negative or constructive feedback as well, because I'm open to all sorts of ideas on how I can improve this world to make it more functional and more fun for anyone that's using it. Okay, so now we have a much larger world. Let's look into the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to see how the world was expanded. So if I just right-click here and inspect. So prior to this update, there were only 4 pieces of ground. So there was 1, 2, 3, 4. There were only these 4 pieces of ground here. But I had to add 5 more pieces of ground to make the world larger, and they were added in the outsides here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way out there in the distance. So this gives us a total of 9 pieces of ground. Every piece of ground is 1000 by 1000 pixels in size. And if we just look at the HTML here, hopefully that's large enough to see, you'll notice that there are 9 pieces of ground. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And you may have noticed that as I go through them, Chrome actually highlights the ground that I'm focused on. So check this out. So ground, 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 and so on. As I go through here, it'll highlight the different pieces of ground. So that's all the HTML that was required. It's pretty straightforward. I just had to copy and paste 5 more pieces of ground, and to make the world even larger in the future, which I will do, it'll just require copying and pasting even more ground. So that's pretty straightforward. Anyone can do that. Next, on to the CSS. There's 2 things I did in the CSS. First, to add more ground, I had to position the pieces of ground using translate X and translate Y portions of the transform attribute. And the second thing I did was I added textures. So these are all CSS textures. If you look at the ground, see these patterns here, these are CSS gradients. These are not images, these are not JPEGs or PNGs. These are actually, these are all coded in CSS, and I'll get to that in a moment. But first let me talk about the placement of the ground, because that's a little bit easier to follow. So every piece of ground has an X and Y coordinate. There's also a Z coordinate, but the Z coordinate is always 0, so we're not going to worry about that. The X coordinate for this ground is 0, 0. So the X is 0, the Y is 0. For the next one, the X is 0, 1,000. For the next one, the X is 0 and the Y is 2,000, and so on. So I just had to place the X and Y. So basically just quickly going through them, this was 1,000, 0, then we have 1,000, 1,000, and then 1,000, 2,000, and then 2,000, 0, 2,000, 1,000, and 2,000, 2,000. So basically I set the X and Y coordinates for every piece of ground, and since every piece of ground is 1,000 by 1,000, we're just incrementing X and Y by 1,000 so that these all get laid out in a grid. So now we have a 3 by 3 grid. I'd like to have a 5 by 5 grid, and I think that'll be the limit of how big this world gets, and then it'll be programmed so that you can walk around infinitely and ground will spawn in front of you as you walk forward and disappear behind you as you leave ground behind you. But anyway, those are the dimensions that were set in CSS. Then to get to the gradients, I talked about this in a previous video, but I'll talk about it again. Basically, see this red pattern here with the squigglies on it, and this blue pattern with sort of, I don't know what you'd call them, kind of these flowers or cool little designs. These are all done in CSS. So what I did was I grabbed these CSS patterns from this website here called CSS Patterns Gallery by Leah Veru. So thanks so much for setting up this website. I did leave a credit in the source code, by the way, so that anyone who clones this project can find that website. But anyway, so for example, for this ground here, let me just inspect this element. So this ground, the class of this ground is called half rhombies, and so that is actually this pattern here. So see, there's a whole bunch of patterns that are offered on the website. I just grabbed this half rhombies pattern, copied the CSS for it. It's 369 bytes, mostly linear gradients, and I pasted it into here. So if we look at the CSS of this ground, we notice that there's this background here with linear gradients. This is copied from this patterns gallery. So I paste that into here, and now we have a cool little gradient background. The same is done with all of these grounds, so all 9 of the grounds have a different gradient on them. It performs faster than if I had used a PNG or JPEG and put that on repeat. So this works out really well. Notice if I turn it off, it just reverts to a default color, which is this pound 3366cc here. But I'll keep that background texture. So that is the CSS. So now I've covered the HTML and the CSS for adding more ground. So now let me go into the JavaScript. The JavaScript was basically used to add more cubes and more mannequins. And this update was pretty simple too. So let me again inspect element, go into our sources, go into the main, because that's where the cubes and the mannequins are added. And very simply, all I had to do was increase the size of these loops. So here's the loop that adds the cubes. Let me make this font a little bit bigger. Okay. So here's the loop that loops through and adds the cubes. It loops from 0 to 9. Once it hits 10, it doesn't loop anymore. So it loops from 0 to 9. In other words, it loops 10 times. And on every iteration of the loop, it creates a new cube entity. It places the cube at a random X and Y location. It adds the cube to an array of cubes, which is used for obstacle detection, and it draws the cube. So that's how we basically draw 10 cubes at random locations. And if I hit refresh, there's going to be 10 cubes at new random locations. So that's pretty much it for cubes, and similarly for mannequins, all I had to do was increase the number of times that we looped through and created randomly placed mannequins. So here's the loops, and now it goes from 0 to 19. And so there are a total of 19 random mannequins that get drawn into the world. So that pretty much covers the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript of making the world larger, adding more cubes, and more mannequins. And by the way, your own mannequin makes it 20. So there's actually technically a total of 20 mannequins in the world, but it only has to loop through 19 because 19 are random. The last one is you, of course. So again, definitely let me know what your comments are. Leave a like on the video if this project is interesting to you. Let me know what ideas you'd like me to program next. There's all sorts of different ideas. And let me know what you think about this update making the world a lot larger. Thank you so much.